Hi everyone, this is Rebecca Zusick with Independent Sector, and I want to welcome you all to today's call. A couple of things before we get started. For those of you who might be new to the Zoom platform, with the webinar feature, everyone's phones have been muted. If you have questions that you'd like to submit, there is a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We're asking that any and all content-related questions go through the Q&A box. If you have any technical issues or anything unrelated that you don't want to ask the speakers and you just need some assistance, feel free to either tag me in the chat feature, which is also at the bottom, or you can send it to any of the panelists as well. And if you have any questions, just please feel free to reach out. We also can check our public policy at independentsector.org email if you're having any problems logging into Zoom via the computer, but you're able to dial in on the phone. So if you have any questions, just reach out to us. With that, I'll turn it over to Allison.
Great, thanks, Becca. Welcome everybody to Independent Sector's webinar, Getting to the Heart of Policy Decisions on Giving. We're really excited to have you join us today and hear from Target Point Consulting and Michael Myers, who's the expert at Target Point, talk about some research that they did on behalf of Independent Sector to help us understand how to better message around the issues of giving, in particular giving incentives to voters, and hopefully that will also translate to policymakers. We have a lot of interesting findings that have come out of this research, and we want to jump right in. So we're going to get started and cover some basics. There we go. So I should have introduced myself. I'm Allison Grayson. I'm the Director of Policy Development and Analysis here at Independent Sector. And we're also joined today by Michael Myers, Target Point partner and president. And we're really excited to have a conversation with you today. Really quickly, I just want to acknowledge that this research was conducted by Target Point, but made possible through the generosity of Charles Stewart Mott Foundation, Fidelity Charitable Trustees Initiative, and Leadership 18. So quickly to cover our agenda for the day and what you know is in store for you in this webinar. First, we're going to cover research background and methodology, and then we're going to hit the key findings. So we're going to start you off with, here's what we found was really interesting, and then we're going to delve into the details. First, charitable giving opinions and habits, and then messaging on expanding charitable giving incentives. And then the last piece of the webinar will be, okay, how do we start using this information in our advocacy and policy work? So first, with the background and methodology, I wanted to start by just explaining why Independent Sector chose to commission this research. We know that research shows that policy decisions are made through emotions. They're often influenced by values. It's not made by reason. In particular, Jonathan Haidt and Drew Weston are two cognitive psychology researchers who have demonstrated this. And it's really important information for us to keep in mind, because often as nonprofit advocates, we start conversations with data and we make appeals based on reason. So we want to make sure we're not leaving out critical elements that we could be using in our messaging to appeal to different audiences' emotions. Then we wanted to also acknowledge that in order to motivate action, we need to target different audiences' emotions and values. Targeting means that we don't necessarily need to apply the same values to every single audience. We may want to be strategic and use different kinds of value messaging depending on who we're speaking to. Messaging with only a few values may limit nonprofit policy impact and longer-term goals. Primarily, nonprofits use conversely, if you fail to provide this policy or funding, people may be hurt as a result, is usually our default. It also happens to correlate nicely with the way that we frame fundraising appeals, so it may explain why we're very comfortable using this messaging. But we want to make sure that we're not missing opportunities because we're sticking to only one or two values-based messages. And then finally, messaging research, this messaging research will enable nonprofits to build more support for our cross-cutting policy issues. So that's the goal of this research today. So now we're going to start covering methodology and delve into the details of the research. And for that, I'm going to turn it over to Michael.
All right. Thank you all for joining us today. Excited to be part of this presentation. Just a quick note on the methodology, and basically this is just to say that the independent sector and the folks that help fund this put the resources that need to be put into this to get a high quality product. We talked to people on their phones. We included a big sample, 300 interviews on people's mobile phones, so make sure that we've got a good representative sample. And a margin of error, just like on any survey work or any poll, is quite low on this one, just over 3%. So we've got a good solid sample of people and a good representative group of people across the country, and the ability to dig into the crosstabs and some of those key subgroups and target audiences that Allison was talking through. As we go through, there were two parts of this research, in the science books, political science books, they call qualitative and quantitative pieces to this. So we talked about the survey part at the beginning, and then we also did two sets of focus groups. So we went to Grand Rapids, Michigan, where we talked to a group of swing voters about these issues, and then talked to a group of what we call engaged voters, high news consumers, people that tend to follow public policies and things like that. We picked Grand Rapids for a number of reasons, but it was nice, most importantly, to be able to get outside of not only the DC Beltway, but some of the big city beltways that research tends to get conducted in. So for instance, we did go to Atlanta, Georgia. We talked to people that live in a large metropolitan area, but going to Grand Rapids let us get a little more flavor of what sometimes are called real people. And I'm not sure people in New York or LA aren't real people, but people that don't necessarily live in giant media markets and are deluged on a daily basis, and don't tend to watch MSNBC and CNN quite as much as they do in these other areas. In Atlanta, we talked to what we came to call rock-ribbed Republicans. You could think of them as Republican primary voters, hard Trump voters, folks like that, and then a very different group of minority voters in the city, in and around the city of Atlanta. So we really have a nice flavor here of both a national survey with some ability to do some deep dive look into subgroups, and then also a very nice ability to have paired that with being able to actually look people in the eye and see their reactions to different messages, hear from them the kinds of words that they were using, which then did help us shape and form the survey itself as we walked through that, and the types of messages that we thought would work well throughout. So all of this is going to be based around those three big groups of findings from the survey, from the work we did in Grand Rapids, and the work we did in Atlanta. And as you can imagine, trying to boil down, so each of those focus groups is 2 hours long. So we spent 8 hours actually talking to people, and then we have 1,300 some interviews to go through. Trying to boil that down, there's a lot to pick from. And I think it's helpful to sort of start at the end almost, so that we can really zoom in and pay attention to what did we really learn here. So we came up with what we agreed on 6 key findings. And the first one I think is very important for everybody on this phone call, to recognize that you start in a very strong position, and I'm sure that you get pushback from some leadership and from some number crunchers on the Hill and in different state capitals as you try to advocate for these things. But the nonprofit sector is in a very strong spot, and the idea of a expanded charitable tax deduction is very popular. When we just ask people off the top of their heads before we give them any reasons to be for it, 3 out of 4 Americans say, I think that's a good idea. After we give them some messages, that number actually goes up to 82%. So better than 4 out of 5 Americans saying this is a good idea. And often we would see that number go down when you start as high as 74%. As anyone familiar with American politics today, there's not a lot that 74% of Americans agree on. It would probably be difficult to get 74% of people in Washington, D.C. to agree whether it was raining or sunny today, depending on who we talk to. So that is a very strong number, and an unusually high number and a consensus to be able to get to. The second thing that clearly came out of the focus groups was that leveraging local organizations and local chapters really helps serve as the most effective messengers. And whether that's a local chapter of a large national or international organization, or truly individual, whether it was animal shelters or homeless shelters, Those were the organizations and the groups people were most likely to identify with and most likely to want to go advocate for. They certainly appreciate the work that the Red Cross does on a national basis. They love what the Red Cross does in their community. They love what church organizations do around the globe. They love the fact that they have a help feed the homeless in their communities. So really keeping that in mind and trying to pair that local feel as much as we possibly can as we advocate for our positions. Specifically, as we started to dig deeper into the idea of a charitable tax deduction and why we would need that, people were aware of the recent changes in the tax codes, and that a lot of that change as far as what they were going to be impacted by was this change in the standard deduction. And they were still not clear of how this would actually affect them. So this was in early March. People had begun to start filling out their taxes. There had been news reports of whether people's average refund was up or down or sideways or what that was. So there was a somewhat of an understanding of why we were talking about this issue. And it has grown. We conducted some similar research a year ago just on the survey side of that, where we saw 59% of people saying that they plan to take the standard deduction. This year it had gone up to 69%. So coming pretty close to matching what I think the real numbers will probably come in at. And then when we dig into the messages that best help advocate for our position, dealt with the matter of fairness. And that was really pretty much across the board, that it was only fair that if some people were going to be able to take a charitable deduction, that everyone should be able to take advantage of that. And we'll dig into the specifics of that here in just a moment. But that was an overarching thing that we saw throughout, that people wanted it to be fair and available to all. Among Republicans, we do see a little bit of a difference, and we focused a bit on Republicans because especially on the Hill, they can be a bit more of a challenge at times to persuade on these issues. And while the matter of fairness was important to them, we also saw this idea of again, playing to their values, that if we can support charities, if we can give them the tools that they need to be successful, that can help prevent a greater reliance on government programs. And we were careful not to argue that charities were going to replace the role of government in local communities and in supporting those in need, or replacing the social safety net, but that an effective charitable sector can help limit the need and the call for more government spending and more government programs. And that played well into the Republican value set as you think through that. So probably helpful at this point just to run through kind of a quick review of what people had told us about their opinions on habits on charitable groups in general. We asked people if they had donated any money to a religious organization, charity, or charitable cause within the past year. 3 out of 4 folks said that they had done that. As we talked through with the focus groups, that seemed about right. Some people would kind of almost forget sometimes the charitable things they gave. It's clear that with younger folks, what a charity means may not fully match up with the IRS codes, that the GoFundMe campaigns and things like that, they see that every bit as much of a charity as what we think of as traditional organized charity. So certainly some of those numbers are in there. When we asked them how much had they given, you see a pretty good spread of giving history. We did capture a good chunk of folks that give large sums of money of in that $10,000 to $25,000 a year range, more than $5,000. The average donation was about $1,700, almost $1,800, up just slightly from what we saw in 2017. We saw of those 3 quarters who had given, 7 out of 10 gave under $1,000, and 3 out of 10 gave over $1,000. So a good spread, a good variety of donor types and donor sizes represented throughout the survey. We ask on a scale of 1 to 5 how important are charities in your local community, where we tell them that a 1 is that they're not important at all. We only see 10% of folks sort of playing the position that they don't play an important role, whereas you see almost 3 times that number saying that they are 5, extremely important, top of the list. So 81% of people see charities as playing an important role. I would point out that 10% can be loud. You are probably hear from them at times, and they do tend to identify the most likely group defined in there, and it certainly isn't exclusively these folks, but they tend to be more Republican, more middle-aged, and more white. So the person that you see most likely complaining to a congressman or to a city councilman, if we're advocating on a more local level, is that same person that we see in the national surveys of reflecting an anti-organized charitable view. Here we touch on the idea of the standard deduction, whether people will itemize or take the standard deduction. That in the past, people told us that 59% said that they had taken a standard deduction in the past, where 69% said they would take it this year. So you see an increase, people recognizing that they are more likely to take that. And it was sort of the right basic group of people that were more likely to be saying that they itemized last year and would take the standard deduction this year. So sort of that upper middle income, the $100,000 to $200,000 earner, much more likely to take that standard deduction, up 37% in 2018, 58% this year. And this next slide reflects that same thing, that folks that said that they would itemize both years tended to have significantly higher incomes, almost twice as high as those who intended to take the standard deduction both last year and this year. And then that middle sort of swing group being that little higher upper middle income area. So people were starting to figure out this tax code impact. And as much as we'll talk on this, I don't want to dwell on looking back at the changes to the tax code. It is important, I think, to recognize that people were understanding that something had changed here. We then try to get at what the real impact of that would be. So we told people that under the new tax laws Congress had passed, many of us would no longer receive a deduction for charitable giving. What impact would that have on you? When we asked, and this is why I think it's great to be able to do the focus groups and survey work. When we looked people in the eyes at the focus groups, very few people would admit it would have any impact on them. There's obviously a social bias to this. No one wants to admit that they give because they get a deduction or because they get the coffee mug or they get the tote bag, but clearly those things do matter. When we get to the anonymity of a phone call, where you're not actually looking your neighbors in the eye, we see almost 30% of people saying that this would have some impact, that they would either give less or stop giving altogether. And another 8% admitting that they're unsure. So depending on how you want to look at that, that 8% is probably leery of, like, probably doesn't quite want to say that they might give less, but could easily shift into that category. So this is a real impact, and all of you, I'm sure, can do the budgets. If 6% of your donors stopped giving altogether and 21% of your donors began to give less, it certainly would have a huge impact. And lawmakers, I think, can understand that concept as well. When we try to take it out the next level and take it away from you, that of course you will probably continue to give, but what about people across the country? What impact could that have on people across the country? They tell us when they think about their friends and neighbors, so not me, but other people like me, 30% would give much less money, 45% would probably give somewhat less money. Only 20% that they think would have no impact on giving. So this is a resonating message that even if people don't want to admit it to themselves, but they can see that this will have an impact across the country, and that impact we will see is not a good impact, not what they want to see out of the charitable sector. So we then give them a potential solution to this, and how could we fix things, and began talking to them about the value of a universal standard deduction. And this came from one of the swing voter groups in Grand Rapids that we did, and this was a direct quote that I think helps kind of sum up what we saw there. That the focus groups and in the messaging, you'll be able to see that people do think that there are two types of giving, that there are people that just give from the heart, and that in fairness, I think people would have told us that they think even the same person can have two different motivations depending on who and what they're giving. Sometimes we give from the heart, or sometimes we're giving to get something back, whether that's credit with the boss or credit with our neighbors or just to feel good, or to get the coffee mug. Or to get that charitable tax deduction, that those do play a role. But regardless of why you're giving, you're both going to be able to claim it, and it's going to make everybody happy. If you take one of those away, you're going to start losing giving, no matter which way it is. And I think that is the most effective way. It's maybe not the most eloquent statement, but those are the way real people talk about this, that they do see an impact being had out there. So when we say, hey, one of the ways to fix this would be to expand the charitable tax deduction to all taxpayers. And I need to be careful. We did not phrase this as a fix. We phrased this as an idea that's out there. Would you support or oppose efforts to expand the charitable tax deduction to all taxpayers, regardless of income or whether or not they itemize on their tax returns? 47% of people said, I think that is an excellent idea. I strongly support that. We see almost no partisan differences. Differences in motivation, we'll get into those values and motivations in a minute. But on the top line, basically 50% of all the partisan groups say, I strongly support that idea. I think that is great. I think the charitable groups that I deal with, that I know in my community, that I see on the news, that I see responding to hurricanes, that I see responding to the fires, they do a great job, and we should be doing more to make sure that people can receive some benefit from the donations that they give to those organizations. Only 12%, 13% oppose that idea. And that rang pretty true throughout the focus groups as well. We then went in, we tested 6 specific messages to see what impact those would have. As Allison mentioned, these try to play off of various values that we took a look at. So we looked at the fairness idea, that expanding the charitable tax deduction is a matter of fairness, that it should not be just to the wealthy. Every individual and family who donates should receive some benefit. We took a look at the idea that, a more straight economic argument, that providing a financial incentive to give will mean people will be able to give more and enable charities to do more in their communities. Pretty straightforward. We specifically saw coming out of the focus groups the value people were placing on smaller, what they viewed as more local charities, and that expanding the charitable tax deduction would help protect especially those smaller local charities who rely on lots of small donations from low income and middle class donors. We'll see that was an effective message with groups. We looked at the idea that this is just a simple fix to the tax code, try to play a little bit of playing to the idea that the middle class does not always get advantage of the loopholes, and that this would be a simple, easy way to give them a tax benefit. We then had what proved to be a very powerful message with some key subgroups, the idea that charitable giving is a key value to America, and that having an expanded charitable tax deduction would help send that message, especially to the younger generations, that charitable giving is in fact a key American value, that it should be rewarded. And then we looked at what we thought would be especially value-driven argument to Republican and conservative voters, that helping churches and charities care for those in need is always a better alternative than turning to more government programs. Expanding the charitable tax deduction will help make sure they have as many resources as possible. So those were the messages that we took out into the field following the focus groups. And then here you can see the results of those. Very powerful messages. When we do our traditional polling work for a candidate running for office, whether that's mayor or city council or president of the United States, if we can find messages where you get 35% of people that are really motivated by that issue, that's pretty good. Those are messages that become TV commercials. If we can find messages where 45% of people are strongly motivated, so would get in that much more supportive category, those are the ones that you're going to see repeated on the news over and over and over again. And it's hard to find those 45% issues. In the old days, in 2004 when President Bush was running, we always looked for 45% issues. It is very hard to find 45% issues in messages today. We have managed to put 6 of them together on the board that get over 45%. So you see a rank ordering of those messages. Clearly the fairness argument was our best message. 58% of people said that message made them much more supportive. And on all of these messages, very little, if any, meaningful pushback. Essentially people that really do not like this idea refuse to admit that any of these messages are worthwhile. So you see the matter of fairness clearly at the top with almost 6 out of 10 voters saying that makes them much more supportive. But then the next 5, again, are in an order. These are their order. But with them all being up over 45%, these are all good, powerful messages. And you can see even with the partisan groups, you don't see a ton of difference, although you do see some clear differences on a couple of these. So that Republican message that is at the bottom, conservative-oriented message of charitable sector being a better alternative to more government programs, an outsized response amongst Republicans versus independents and Democrats. But you can see everyone responding to that fairness argument, and then you see the varying levels of support, the key American value, good, strong message. We're going to dig into some of the groups that find those. And this is great in a couple of ways, as far as I would see as you look to go to deploy this around your communities and your states and advocacy in the capitals, is that one, it doesn't box us into a particular policy position, that these value-driven arguments are basically built around the value of the charitable sector and ways to bring more resources to them. So these are good, powerful messages that can be multi-purpose to lots of potential policies, especially policies that are universal in nature, that try to be as broad-based as they can be, and frankly, as simple as they can be. And it also means that if your organization is particularly fits well with one of these arguments versus the others, you can make those arguments without a fear of pushback or setting the movement back, if we think of it that way. So a really good set of arguments to be able to make here, a really good set of messages, and it gives us a great deal of freedom as a sector to be able to go out and talk about these issues and the reasons we're advocating so strongly. So after we make those arguments to folks and we give them those messages, we basically ask them again, now that you've learned a little bit more about this, what's your opinion? And we actually see support increase. Some groups move stronger than others, but we saw 15% of voters move into that strongly supporting category after the messages. They tended to be younger, more female, more likely to identify as Democrats than Republicans. The fairness message is what really helped push them there. So while everybody gets better and moves in the right direction, so in this case, if you think of moving across that screen from the right to the left, we see all the categories moving the way you'd want them to. Millennials particularly swung. They start off as one of our weakest groups on the messaging, lots of undecideds amongst those groups, and ended up being the most improved group on this post, what we think of as a post-ballot or after messaging question. And it would not be uncommon for support to go down when it starts at 74%. That sometimes once people realize, like, well, you're asking me all these questions about this issue, there must be some criticism of it, there must be some debate I'm not aware of. And in this case, we don't see that our messages not only move everybody in the right direction, but especially important, move up that strong support category, where we're now up over a majority of people strongly supporting our position. We also tested a slightly different argument of the idea that maybe charitable donations shouldn't be taxed at all, a real liberty-based kind of argument, the liberty value, that donations are not really income at all because they serve the common good, they should never be taxed in the first place. People say, yeah. I'm impressed with this one in that it is it seems like a little bit of an academic, maybe arcane is not the right word, but a more in the weeds kind of argument that people might be inclined to take the easy pass at and just say, oh, I'm not sure about that, or I somewhat agree, or I somewhat disagree. But you still get almost 50%, getting close to 50% of folks saying, this is an idea that I can get behind and really agree with. So if we looked at that charitable gift argument in context with those other messages, it comes in just below that 45% that we were trying to get at, but certainly well above that 35%. So if we looked at that as a message as opposed to a particular issue, that also works well. And again, to me, what it speaks to is that people want the charitable sector to have the resources, as many resources as they can get. There's not a thought out there that most charities have more money than they know what to do with. And people, again, in the focus groups, they were aware of some bad actors. They could point out to some article they had read about somebody. There was some criticism of, the church down the road from me just built this fancy new building. I'm not sure they really need this. So it wasn't as if they weren't aware of any concerns out there, but they recognize that as a whole, the sector does really good work, and they want to see that work supported and resourced appropriately. Here's where we dig a little bit into some of those subgroups, and you can see where the messaging, these getting the right values to the right people when we have limited time to speak to them, where we have a short opportunity, whether that's trying to do some stuff on social media, or we're actually giving a speech, or just as simple as ending up in the elevator with somebody. You can start to see where there are different messages that really help motivate action on our end and get people nodding their heads and saying, yes, you guys are moving in the right direction. So we've gone through and tried to label the first and second messages. The idea of really of that fairness argument works with everybody, or technically almost everybody. Younger middle-aged voters were not as moved by that as everyone else. But then it's what's that second argument? What's that follow-up? So when you make that fairness argument, you start to get heads nodding. I think it's going to be that second argument we make that actually gets people moving, gets them out of their chair, gets them to click the button that says share, gets them to go ahead and send that letter to their congressman, and gets, frankly, the staff and people around these congressmen also to decide that this is the right thing to do because we're really tapping into the right value system. So we'll get into some of the specifics, but you get the ideas here of depending on the audience we're talking to, we can help really essentially get that second message right into these folks as we move through here. Just a couple other examples. There's a little bit of regionality to it. The Northeast has a little bit of a different setup. You'll see in the West, that matter of fairness sort of swamped everything else, that the other issues were all sort of tertiary. So we just have one best issue in the West. And then you see the different levels of information here. As you walk through here, you start to see that protect the small local charities pops up pretty strong. That upper middle income bracket, the simple tax code was a nice message to folks there. That not surprising that those probably most affected by the tax changes are those arguing to keep it simple, and the different ideas and senses you get there. So if we take a look and try to boil this all down on the messaging front, we like to look at what we would think of as both issues that are very popular and issues that are persuasive, and try to take a look at both of those. So the most popular I always talk about is if you're giving a speech and all you want to do is get people's heads nodding in your direction, how can I get the most heads nodding in any given room? So if we show up in a room full of 100 average Americans and we talk about a fairness argument and then providing a financial incentive to give, like an expanded charitable deductions means more people are able to give more and charities are able to do more, we are going to get a lot of heads nodding in our direction and saying, yep, you guys are right. You're on the right track. Tell me more. If we really want to go in and persuade those heads that aren't immediately nodding, where we want to get outside of our choir and dig a little deeper and try to actually change people's minds. Three arguments help us change people's minds. And we're fortunate in that the one that's most likely to get people's heads nodding and change their minds is the same one. That fairness argument works well both to get heads nodding and also to get brains thinking and changing their positions. Then the second most persuasive one, so again, the one that actually moved people in our direction, was the idea of sending the right message to the next generation and enshrining the charitable tax deduction in the tax code and the value that represents. And then the third one was that more conservative oriented message of that it's better than a government program. It is a better alternative than an increase in government spending and government programs. So that was trying to take a look at if we were talking to a group of average Americans. If you've been tasked to go talk to the Republican Lincoln Day Club or the Eisenhower clubs or things like that, what's the best way to get Republican heads nodding? Again, talk about fairness. You'll hear this a lot. Pretty much every group talking about fairness is the best way to get heads nodding. And then additionally, to get their heads nodding, talking about that this is an expanded charitable deduction that helps fund a robust charitable sector, means that we don't have to rely on government to do as much, is the best way to do that. And then persuading Republicans, again, fairness, and then just the idea that people will be able to give more and charities will be able to do more in our communities. Those were the best combos there. So again, as we look at sort of the major takeaways, just kind of go back to where we started with and add a little context and a little warning signs as we kind of come up with what are the big picture takeaways here. That again, our policies to increase giving are broadly supported regardless of the specific message, and to some extent, regardless of the specific issue that we take. Again, the more broad-based you can be, I think the better off you will be. The more you can deploy local messengers and local examples, the better you will be. Really think through of more than one message that we want to play into those values, and most of us have 1, 2, 3 values that are at play, trying to get those right. And get the targeted messages into those groups that our problem really isn't getting heads nodding, it is getting people out of their chairs and actually acting on these things. And then the last thing, and even I slipped during the presentation, it's an easy slip to do, especially if you've been advocating in this space for 2 or 3 years, of trying to be cautious about framing this around the 2017 tax bill. And so, especially amongst Republicans and even some of the independent groups, the idea that we're going to go fix what got screwed up by President Trump and the Republicans started to sour the taste a little bit. The more we could just keep this as a forward-looking thing, as the right thing to do, the fair thing to do, and not spend a lot of time reflecting on the idea that this was a mistake that needs to be corrected, but simply an opportunity to help the charitable sector, that proved much more powerful. So I think that that's an easy thing to slip into, and something I would encourage folks to avoid as much as you can. So as we look to, again, how to start putting this to real work, we touched on this just a minute ago, and just want to kind of pound on this because I do think it is important, of recruit local charities to help make the message case with you. Identify those 2 to 3 messages that fit your target audience for just about everybody, if not everybody. That fairness message really works. And then that second emotional message that they can tap into their values really helps provide that 1, 2, 3 punch that you need. I think keeping this focused around the future of being positive, that more donors means a more robust charitable sector. It means more ability to do more, to help fill the needs that clearly are out there. And that we don't need to frame this around the fix to the 2017 tax bill. But I think at the same time, it is a little bit of a double-edged sword of that. We want to be careful not to argue that the 17 bill hasn't had an impact, and that we don't want to fall into either trap. That this isn't about fixing a mistake, but it is about helping provide the resources that we desperately need in order to fill our roles in the community. So it's a balancing act for the advocates, and I think maybe something we would want to talk through in more detail of how you do that, and certainly folks will have some best practices that they've got in mind, but trying to walk that fine line of not being critical of the bill, but also not saying like, oh no, it's had no impact on us. We don't really need because policymakers hear that as, I don't need this then. I don't need the fix. I don't need a charitable universal deduction. And then we begin to undermine our position as a result. So in a perfect world, if you tasked me and said, hey, Myers, you got to go lobby on the Hill, go talk to a bunch of Democratic policymakers, what would I go do? I would gather up local charities that are going to mean something to that policymaker, that decision maker, and or his or her staff that I know that they care about. Try to do a little research on who those right people are. And then I'm going to go in there, I'm going to talk about matter of fairness, that everyone who donates to charity deserves to get this charitable deduction. I'm going to try to do that in a positive way and not be critical, not try to make an argument that the wealthy don't deserve this, but that everyone deserves to have it. I'm going to talk about how, charitable giving is a key American value, and that expanding the deduction will help send a powerful message, especially to the next generation. I'm going to especially do that if the decision maker I'm talking to is a little bit older. And then I think you do want to work in some of the data points. So for instance, last 15 years, the number of Americans donating in charity has dropped by an alarming 10%. We don't want to continue to see that go. We don't want charity to become something that only the rich do. That we want it to stay a broad-based part of the American fabric of life. Republican policymaker, I'm going to do a similar thing. I'm going to try to match that correct local messenger to that. I'm going to lead with that fairness argument, but then I'm really going to push on this idea that, this is going to help churches. This is going to help local charities. And it's going to help reduce the call for more government programs as those charities are better able to meet at least some of those needs. And I probably flavored in with a little bit kind of a different messaging point, that the charitable deduction could translate to as much as $17 billion more a year. This is a way for Congress to unlock those resources without having to raise taxes, without having to shift spending away, and allow the American public to do what they inherently want to do, and should receive some benefit from. So that is a lot of me talking. I hope that is helpful, and love to try to answer some questions that may be out there.
Great work, Michael. You just ran a marathon of bar charts. So good job. I imagine it's a lot of data for people to take in. So I know a lot of you still may be processing what you heard. If you could think of questions you want to ask or get clarification, please feel free to type it in the question and answer box at the bottom of your screen. Michael, we did receive one question for you that actually has several sub-questions, so we can dig into it a little bit. More broadly, the question was, when polling people about how they felt about a universal charitable deduction in general, how did we present that concept to voters? And I guess this also will apply to the focus groups as well. So how did we present it initially? How did we explain what it was? Did we explain what it was? And then there are some hypotheses that follow up with that in more detailed questions, but I want you to have an opportunity to answer that part first.
Sure. So in the focus groups, we did spend, our initial efforts did talk about this as fixing the 2017 reform, and that's kind of how we got to the idea that was a little bit of a mistake or hurt the framing, at least with some groups. So we did present it as a reaction to the 2017 tax bill, and found that didn't serve us as well as just talking about a positive forward-looking message could do. So in the survey, we presented it as a pretty straight option. We didn't get into the real details. We did tell people that changes of the tax law meant that not everyone would receive the charitable deduction. So what impact would that have on you? We did present that to them. But then when we asked them about the universal standard deduction, we did not frame that as a way to fix the 2017 bill. We just presented it as an idea that people were advocating for. So much more neutral presentation in the survey than especially the first two focus groups that we had done.
So the question also gets into what were people, if they weren't entirely sure that they supported a universal charitable deduction, what were some of the causes that they might have listed? Did they get into cost-benefit analysis? And in particular, this person sort of hypothesized that cost may be a leading reason that people provide. I think people would also like to know if that isn't what people said, were there other reasons that they provided?
Yeah, I think in the focus groups, which is really where we would see this the most, what we saw was sort of a pushback to the idea that people give because they get a deduction. And that people didn't really want to accept the idea. Those that were on the fence or not as supportive kind of kept coming to the idea of like, well, I just can't believe that anybody gives because the government gives them a tax break. And then as soon as we would say like, yeah, that may be your case, that may be your situation, and maybe even many of your friends and family, but we all know that if the government taxes things more, we tend to get less of it. And if they tax less, we tend to get more of it. And they would say, yeah, I agree. But then it kind of fall back. Like that's a little bit of a sticking point of how many people are truly giving. Same thing you probably get on the Hill or in state legislatures of how many people really are giving because of this. So that was the one point. And then if there was any other sticking point, people would start to kind of think through of, well, we're trying to get rid of all these loopholes. Does this create another loophole? Was sort of the other pushback that was there. So I think it was less a cost analysis. I'm not sure many Americans can figure out the budget process and how this impacts scoring and all of that type of stuff. Nor do I think they care all that much at the moment. Both political parties are kind of not talking about costs anymore. So I think that was less than you would have seen at the height of the Tea Party sort of movement for a while. We would have seen more pushback of that this is a government handout type stuff. We didn't really see that this time. It was much more focused around, is it really hurting charities? And we got a lot of that. If, you know, and you guys, again, you've seen this on the Hill of, you know, if you can prove to me this is hurting, then I'd be for it. And that's where the naysayers were at of, I just don't think this is hurting them. And so I'm not sure we need to make a change.
So we have a couple more questions that I want to make sure we get to, but as a quick follow-on question that we've heard in other forums, advocates have heard from policymakers that cost could be a reason why they wouldn't support this. So my question is, this research focuses on influencing voters in the messaging that works for them. And I think there are some questions around to what extent can we confidently translate the findings of this research over to policymakers, or should we treat them as a separate audience? And I know I have thoughts on this, but I want to let you go first. Yeah,
and I'm sure everybody's got a thought on that. You know, again, my pure political clients, I try to get them to wake up and listen to things where 75% of Americans agree on them. And with some pushing on messages, 85% of Americans agree on them. And, you know, while people at the budget committees and at Ways and Means, you know, do have struggling priorities, they've got to get reelected too. They worry about majorities. They worry about, you know, finding ways to not look quite so green eye shaded. And in my head, again, and this is not my job, but I just sit there and think of all the things we're spending money on and all the things that we're scoring. Do we really want to take it out on the charitable sector when there are other things that could fill that void?
So I think my response is also, as I mentioned, that this research is based on cognitive psychology and looking at people's brain chemistry and how they make decisions, make policy decisions. And the vast majority of policy decisions are made sort of with emotion and with your gut. And then after the fact, you kind of come up with the data and the reasoning that supports why you made that decision in the first place. And I think there would be an argument of, well, if this is sort of based on how people think, are policymakers, do they have different brains than the rest of us? Which some people may say yes. But I think that just the foundations of this research and the importance of messaging and the fact that people don't start with a really reasoned approach and a cost-benefit analysis, and sometimes that comes up later in a conversation when they're trying to justify a decision they've already made. It's something just for us to keep in mind, especially if we're hearing pushback, is to really question, you know, is this pushback because these people really don't know what they want to, like what they think, or is it pushback because it's something that's convenient to justify a more values-based decision they've already made? So we have a couple of more questions that are really, really interesting. So one of them are, were there any specifics mentioned when speaking to participants about what expanding the charitable deduction may look like? I'm wondering if people have limits on what might be acceptable and what is too far.
No, we did not pick up any sense that you could kind of go too far on this. The one thing that did seem clear is that people like the simplicity of it. And that anything and some of this goes beyond into other projects we've done for similar clients in sort of the similar areas of, it's a fine line when you start drawing target audiences or you start drawing lines of who does and who doesn't get the benefit, to where things start to sound like things people don't like, whether that's a welfare or a targeted tax credit that they don't get. So the more broad-based we can keep it, the better. So I almost think that limiting it makes our job a little more difficult than keeping it broad. So again, there's a broad support out there to have a healthy and robust charitable sector out there, and there's no real pushback that hey, charities have all they can handle, they don't really need any more.
So I have a couple more questions, but if anyone wants to get in one last question, now's your chance to type it in. We'll make sure it gets into the queue. Really quickly, I think this comes up more in your focus groups, but when you ask people how important are charities in your community, what kinds of charities do you support, what are the types of organizations that they listed?
We heard a lot of animal organizations, of helping take care of of pets, things like that. A lot of homeless shelters, a lot of veterans organizations came up. The food pantry idea, and then obviously, and I probably shouldn't skip over it because it maybe isn't obvious, but churches were the biggest one. That was the most common message or most common mention. But a lot of stuff around homelessness, a lot of stuff around veterans, and a lot of stuff around, I wouldn't say animal rights, but caring for animal shelters, local humane society, that type of stuff. But we heard a big variety. We heard, local grassroots musical groups that are helping kids learn about the value of music and art in their lives. But it was for the most part very local and very much groups that they were involved in.
I participated in or attended a couple of the focus groups. There was a lot of churches, but it was a wide range of activities. As you mentioned, they were all local. Some of them, I think, even it would be questionable if they qualified as charities.
Yeah.
But it was something they were involved in personally that they felt like was doing good in the community, which was really interesting.
Yeah.
We have a question that says, can you explain the question about not taxing charitable deductions in the first place? Isn't that essentially what a universal charitable deduction would do?
That's a good question, one I keep trying to wrap my head around too. And I think it's just, and I'm sure there's policymakers that could answer it better, but I think the idea being of treat it more like a 401k type contribution where it doesn't show up. And then I think the liberty-based argument is that the government shouldn't decide to give that money back to you, that it should never take it from you in the first place. So I'm sure on a policy level, and if you're writing the bill, there's vastly different parts of the code you have to amend. I think in most people's ears, and given the responses they had, they don't see a huge difference between those two.
I think this message, we asked for it to be included in the survey because it was something that advocates were using on the Hill that they thought could be effective with certain audiences. Because it had this liberty frame and a freedom frame of, this is something that never should be subject to taxation or considered income subject to taxation in the first place, because it's actually going to the community. It's not something the individual is personally benefiting from. So you can get into policy details about how it is or is not exactly the same as a universal charitable deduction, but we were really interested in it from a messaging standpoint. Yeah. So one last question for you, Michael. Given all the work that you've done both in this research, but you've also helped us do some polling on the charitable community in the last 2 years as well, do you have any recommendations going forward that we should think of in terms of how we can better message around the importance of charitable giving or the role of the charitable sector?
Yeah, I mean, I think the stuff we've done in the past that I wouldn't want people to forget about I think some of those data points that we had at the end of those messaging, I think you want to make sure that we do have those in our arsenal. That I think that does help seal the deal. And a lot of times, as Allison was talking about, you can get people there on an emotional level, but they do want a data hook to be able to sink their teeth into 2 days later when they come back to it. And they want to be for it. They want to be able to go to their colleagues and say, like, well, God, did you know these data points? Because that's an easier message for them to communicate. The same reason we fall into that trap. It's an easier message to communicate. So I think we want to make sure that we do give our friends on the Hill, and as we persuade or convert people, that we do get them the data that goes along with this, that we use the messaging to get their attention, to get them motivated, but then be able to provide that. And I think maybe the biggest thing I would do, just having sat in a few of the rooms with some of your members and some other folks, is be confident and be secure that you're doing these guys a favor by giving them something that they can support, that they can go back to their communities and have 75 or 85% of people pat them on the back for doing. That you're not asking them to take a tough vote here. You're not asking them to go against the will of their constituents. You're not asking them. There's a lot of decisions that, in fairness, these guys know if they go back home, half the people are going to be mad at them and half of the people will forget they did anything. And so this is an opportunity for them to do not only what's right, but will be very popular back home.
So we had someone ask in the questioning box, So does this mean we can't just say the message, "We told you so"? But I think what I'm hearing from you is we don't even have to say "we told you so." We actually can message and say, "You're welcome that we're here, and we're giving you something really positive that you can go back and tell your constituents."
Yeah.
Yep. And you should be grateful that we're providing you with such an asset. So I think that's a great positive note to end on. Thank you so much, Michael, for this great research and great presentation. I want to let everybody know on the call that this slide deck will be available on our website, independentsector.org, for everyone to download and look at the findings in detail. We want you to use this in your own messaging. If you're having Hill Days, if you're going to go talk to your local district office, feel free to pull this up and figure out how you want to use this messaging and target your audiences. We also have recorded this webinar, and we will be putting it up on our website as well. So if you want to share this with your colleagues, it will be available to do so. One of the questions that we've heard is, so what are the next steps? Independent sector for the messaging research, we are currently exploring additional opportunities to make this information even more accessible. We'll try to figure out what is or is not possible in the next couple of weeks, but the idea is if we have the resources available, we may try to create a small campaign or toolkit that the sector can use with key messaging that would be released after the Giving USA numbers come out, because we feel like that could be a prime time in which policymakers will be having these kinds of conversations. Also, usually comes up in alongside the messaging conversation is, so what policies are we going to be talking about? There are a lot of organizations that already have kind of decided how they feel about what giving incentives they want to support, and that's great. But there's a lot of organizations across the sector that aren't entirely sure which policies they do or do not want to support. So in the coming weeks, Independent Sector is going to release another body of research about the policy part of the conversation that compares 5 different policy proposals that are sort of out there in the world to help those organizations on the fence sort of weigh the costs and the benefits and figure out what makes the most sense for them and what they feel like they can support going forward. The beauty of that, I want to reiterate, Michael's point is these messages, they all work. They're so popular. They don't actually have to dictate what policies we choose. So we can choose the policies we think work best for the sector and for our organization. So it's really nice to be free to have these conversations decoupled, because we can make the best decisions possible. With that, I want to thank all of you for your time. We really appreciate it. If you have any questions, please feel free to follow up with us at independentsector.org or email us at publicpolicy@independentsector.org. And we hope you have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.